So in this tutorial, we're going to learn how to do a silicone two-part box mold. And a two-part box mold is actually it's pretty simple. It's not as difficult as it might sound. I know it sounds a little intimidating, but a two-part box mold is something that I've made several times in the past. And just to show you what a two-part box mold is, I'm going to use this mold right here, which is one I use for lost wax casting, and I also use it for resin casting as well, but it's just a helmet piece, and you put both sides together, and that creates your two-part, two-half silicone mold, and that's created in a box just like this. And you take your piece and you fill half of the box with a compound called alginate, and then you pour silicone over the top. You wait for the silicone to cure, and then you take your piece out. Basically, you flip it. You take the alginate off the other side, and you put the piece back in, and you do silicone on the other side. So that's what we're going to do here. What we're going to be using is this cybernetic eye patch that I have molded out of clay. It's just a clay piece that has a bit of plastic in the center for the lens, and then just some bolt heads around it there to make it look like it's something that would, kind of bolt into the skull. But we're going to use this. This is a bit of a complex shape. A lot of times it's easier to do this kind of two-part box mold when you have a flat piece, but we're going to use this because I need to get it molded, and it's still a decent. It'll make a decent demonstration. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and mix up our alginate. Let's pull this to the side for just a moment. Alginate itself is just a powdery substance. It's almost like talc. It's even lighter, I guess, than talc powder. It's not carcinogenic. It's not dangerous to the body at all. In fact, they use this to make castings for prosthetics, for prosthetic limbs and that kind of stuff. So life casting is done with this. This is one of the integral parts of life casting. So if you needed to cast your hand, or if you needed to cast a foot, something of that nature, you would use alginate because it's non-toxic, and all it takes is water. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to mix up. Now, normally you would mix the water, 1 part water to 1 part alginate. It's exact measurement. I'm actually using a little bit more water because I want this to be sort of soupy. I want it to be more liquidy than normal. And this alginate will start absorbing the water really quick. But yeah, you want this to be more runny than it normally would be. So what I did was I put in about maybe 3/4 of an ounce more water. I put in a little over 3 ounces of alginate and about 4 ounces of water. So that will actually make it slightly more runny. It just means it will take it a little bit longer to set up, but that's fine. All right, and you don't have a super long time, so I like to use these paper cups because it will actually allow me to make sort of a funnel tip there. You don't want to get it on the piece if you can help it. What we're doing here is we're making our center line for the latex. And because this eye patch is, because it's curvy, because it has to contour the face, that makes it quite a bit more difficult. We don't want to get it on there if we can help it. Luckily, like I said before, this stuff is not toxic, so. Now I do have my piece suspended on just a little piece of wood under there. And you're going to say, well, why is that? Well, the reason why is because this has to, you've got to create that center line. The only way to do that well is to suspend it on something so that it's up in the air a little bit, because you've got to get the alginate underneath it. Now what's going to happen is this alginate's going to dry, and what I'll be able to do after it's dried, I'll be able to come back and pour my silicone over the top of that, my first layer. And what the silicone will do is, well, only real layer, you only do one layer each time, but what the silicone will do is it will fill up all of this, and it'll create your first half of the mold. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just popping these air bubbles. I'm just using an X-Acto knife for that. So at this point, all we have to do is we've just got to wait. Oh, sorry. We've just got to wait for this to dry, or to harden up, set up, and I'll back out here a little bit so you can see. When we come back, we'll check this to make sure. We'll check our alginate to make sure that it is nice and set up. That'll take a couple hours, and then we're going to use some Rebound 25 to make our first half, and we're going to use some Rebound 25 to make our second half. All right, so we have let our alginate dry. I ended up letting it dry overnight just because it was late when I was out here working on it before. So it's nice and dry. It will always have sort of a spongy feel to it. Here is a piece of alginate. It will always kind of be wet and spongy unless you let it just dry outside or dry in the heat so that all the water evaporates, or at least sets in. So anyway, that's alginate. See how it's nice, and it's kind of a weird. It's not gummy, but it's soft. So anyway, now we can go ahead and we can start the process of pouring our silicone over to make our mold. And if you look around the inside edges, you'll see that one of the things that I did, because the alginate does tend to want to shrink sometimes, and it did in this case, was I put some plastiline around the inside edge just to keep it, keep the silicone from draining down into the sides, and that makes it a real mess. So so what we'll do now is I'm just putting my gloves on, because that's always important when it comes to using silicone. Also, I'm going to get, I've got a pair of needle nose pliers we're going to use for this too, because we need to put our items to make our registration keys. So I had thought about using some of these little thumb screws and decided against them because they were a little bit taller than I would like. So I just took some really small, I don't know if the camera will focus on that or not, but I got just some really small nuts, and I put a dab of hot glue in them so that they would not get filled with silicone. There we go. All right, so move this up a little bit. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and mix our silicone for the first layer. Not going to use a whole lot, mainly because I don't have a whole lot to use. Slide that out of the way. I'm just going to do, I think I have enough to do, let's pour an 500 cc, 500 milliliters, and if it looks like I've got enough, I'll do 2 full ounces. And that's right at 1.5 ounces. Now we're going to do part A. And that'll give us 3 full ounces of silicone, and that's really plenty. Looks like we've got it mixed up really well. Let's go ahead and pour this in. Now what I want to do is I want to pour in the middle and let it spread out. And the reason why I did that is because I want to make sure that it covers those registration keys nicely. I tell you, silicone can be super messy if you're not careful. I'm also a big fan of getting as much of that out of the cup and in use as possible. One thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my X-Acto knife here and I'm going to pop these little air bubbles as they come up. Now, I could have used my my vacuum chamber to degas this, or at least get the oxygen out of it so these air bubbles would die. But it's such a small amount of silicone that I'm not super worried about it. Alright, so now all we have to do is we simply let this dry. We're going to let this cure, and then we'll be back, and we'll take it out of this, we'll flip it over, and then we'll remove the alginate layer, and then we'll do the other half, and then we'll have our we will have completed our eye patch 2-part box mold. We have we've let our first layer of silicone cure, and as you can see, it's nice and hard now. So what we're going to do is we're just going to remove one of these halves. First, I'm going to gently pull the silicone away from the sides, and I mean very gently, because remember, we still have a clay sculpt underneath this. So then I'm just going to use an X-Acto knife here to get this glue cut into, this hot glue here. We should be able to, there we go. Once we start it, it'll break away pretty easily. Just like that. Perfect. Alright, now just pull the sides open there, and we should be able to pull this piece right out. Look at that. Beautiful, beautiful. Now this is the alginate on the bottom. And you can see the little, this is the little, I put a little square of alginate under it from some that I had poured earlier. This was my little suspension piece that held the, it held the eyepiece or the eye patch up off of the base so that I could get a good pour around it. Now all we're going to do is we're going to gently peel up the alginate. Look at that. That's just beautiful. Now we can leave these plastiline lines on there. That's no problem. These little plastiline pieces, and we can take them off after the fact. But for right now, we need to remove these are our registration keys. And there we go. Trim those little bits. Now, what we need to do at this point is get this back into the our box here. I'm going to pull this plastiline away just slightly so that I can get this hot glue off of here, because we're going to have to re-hot glue it back. It doesn't have to be as tight as it originally was, but it is going to have to hold together. So I already got some hot glue heated up here. So I'm just going to go right along the edge there. Alright, so that's cooled down enough to put the plastiline back in place there. Let's check on this side. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty good on this side. Alright, so our box is rebuilt. Now we're going to set our, pull off these little tags here. We're just going to slide this back in. I just want to make sure I've got the right direction. Alright, so just pushing all these down to make sure all four corners are down nice, and they are. So clean off my work area here. You can toss this alginate out. I'll pop that little square out so you can see there was my little suspended area. So the eye patch was sitting on top of this, and then I poured all the alginate around it. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to spray that with mold release, because if you don't spray it with mold release, you're going to be in trouble, because silicone does like to stick to silicone. So I'm just going to use some Smooth On Universal Mold Release. Hit it up with mold release. And I don't know that there's any such thing as too much mold release, to be completely honest with you. Some people might say, yeah, there is, but I won't say that. Alright, so I already have a cup here, so let's put our gloves on. We're 500 milliliters of Part A and Part B to make 3 full ounces. Alright, so we've scraped it all out, and now let's go ahead and mix her up. All right, so that should be good. So let's go ahead and pour this off. Now we'll just take the X-Acto and we'll pop these air bubbles here. Not that it matters too much, because there's not many air bubbles, but they are coming out, so that's good. Then everything is good to go. All right, so we're going to let this go ahead and cure. That's going to take a few hours to fully cure. I'm going to let it rest overnight, and we will come back and we'll see exactly how well this two-part silicone mold has turned out. All right, so our our mold here, our silicone mold, the top half is nice and hard and cured, as you can see. So now it's time to debox our mold. So what I'm going to do is, just like we did before, using my X-Acto, I'm just going to make a little cut right here. And I'll make another cut over here. And we should just be able to pull this. There we go, and it comes apart. I like saving these little boxes because they really do come in handy down the road if you have another another item that you need to mold. All right, so we've got that out. Now you're going to see where there's a little bit of overlap on the silicone there, but that's fine. This is why we used the plasticine here, or the plastiline clay, to make a nice visual dividing line. We just cut over that, cut around that line there. Let's not cut too far down. There we go. Now we just have to pull these pieces apart. There we go. That's one of our registration keys. We're going to keep moving around here. There's our other registration key. Keep on moving. There goes our other registration key. And finally, we're on the last one. And there it comes. And look at that. All right, so we'll pull this piece off like that. And you can see the little bolts are still stuck in there, but that's fine. Now this is a little bit different than other molds because on this mold, that's how it fits together right there. The way this mold is made, we've got to pour it from the top. And that's where we've got to be really careful to make sure that we get a really good pour in on this. Now, ideally, this is going to be the outside, and then this is the back side that nobody really sees. So there's a couple little air bubbles on that side, as you can see right there, but I'm not really that concerned about it because that's the side that fits right up at your eye. And this is the side that faces out. But what we need to be able to do is we need to have a hole right in here that we can pour this into. We can either pour it from that side or we can pour it from this side. Either way, I don't think it makes a big difference. We've got to be able to pour it in here, and I'm of the opinion that since this side is the furthest back, we should just make our hole right there. Because it's not going to touch. So there'll be airspace in there. So we just want to be able to pour our liquid in. So what I'm going to do is, let me scrape that away. I'm going to make the pour hole over here. And the other reason why I want to do it on the back side here is because when I trim that off, after I pour this and I trim that off, you won't be able to see it. So what I'm going to do is slightly different than a lot of other molds, because a lot of other molds you will cut your pour spout on the side, but I don't want to do that because we're making this we're going to be using this for silicone casting, not for resin casting, so that makes a huge difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my pour hole over here. I'm just using my X-Acto. Of course that's not going to be big enough, but I do want to just put the mold back together to see exactly how it looks, and it's pretty good. So now we need to cut a little bit more up and through there. You need a large enough hole so that either the silicone or the resin can get down there relatively easy. There we go. I'd say that's a pretty good hole. Good enough for this. All right, I can just see a little bit of light. I don't know if you can see it in the camera or not. There you go. You can see a little bit of, you can see all the way through it to the other side. That's good. That's what you want. Now this mold is ready to pour. We will still have to use some rubber bands and some Centra to hold this together because it's not, on its own, it's not going to hold. But yeah, that's it. That's our box mold. And that came out really well. And the clay here is still shaped perfectly. I'll be interested to see how this works. One thing that when on this mold, because it has got recessed areas like this that are kind of under, I'll have to make sure that I spray the mold release really good in there so that all of this will release. So yeah, thanks for joining us here for another Warmaster's Workshop tutorial. Hope you have learned how to do a two-part box mold. You can always hop over to my Patreon page if you enjoy these tutorials and are learning something. That's patreon.com/warmastersworkshop. I've got some really cool rewards for my patrons, so feel free to support the shop as I continue making these tutorials. And thanks for joining us, and we will see you next month in the Warmaster's Workshop.